When we got together in the studio, whoever had written the song would be the kind of boss.
When people think about the Beatles, they usually imagine effortless genius. Four young men from Liverpool creating timeless music that seemed to flow out of them with ease. But behind that polished image, the reality was often more complicated. Even George Martin, the producer who was seen as the fifth Beatle, faced moments where the music stretched his own abilities to the breaking point. There was one song in particular that Martin admitted was too intricate for him to play. For the man who orchestrated and shaped so much of the Beatles' sound, that admission revealed just how ambitious and at times overwhelming the band's creative drive had become. The Beatles had already pushed Martin into new territory many times. From experimenting with tape loops to orchestrating ambitious arrangements, he was expected to bring their wildest ideas to life. But as the years went on, the demands became heavier, the compositions more complex, and the pressure to innovate unrelenting. The song that tested him most came during the later period of the band's career, when tensions inside Abbey Road were high, and the band's vision for their music was evolving far beyond standard rock and roll. Paul McCartney, in particular, was at the center of this. His restlessness drove him to write pieces that blurred the lines between pop, classical, and experimental music. He had the musical vocabulary to imagine parts that were technically challenging, often demanding arrangements that rivaled professional classical scores. George Martin was no stranger to orchestration, but McCartney's ambitions sometimes bordered on unreasonable. One of these compositions left Martin stunned. The piano part was so elaborate that even he, a trained classical musician, admitted he could not perform it to the standard Paul envisioned. For Martin, this wasn't just about technical skill. It was about the pressure of being surrounded by musicians who were constantly raising the bar. The Beatles expected him to deliver perfection, but here was a moment where he had to acknowledge his own limits. McCartney, unwilling to compromise, had to bring in someone else to play the part. That decision alone underscored the shift in dynamics between the producer and the band. In the early years, Martin had been the authority, guiding and refining their sound. But now, by the late 1960s, the roles had reversed. The Beatles were dictating the terms, and Martin was forced to adapt or step aside. The song in question was Martha, My Dear, featured on the White Album. On the surface, it sounds like a pleasant, piano-driven piece, but beneath its cheerful exterior lies a deceptively complex piano arrangement. McCartney composed it with his usual precision, crafting intricate rhythms and chord progressions that required a level of fluency many trained pianists would find daunting. George Martin, despite his experience, found it too intricate to execute flawlessly. It wasn't just the speed or the finger work, it was the constant shifts in timing, the subtle variations that demanded a level of concentration closer to that of a concert pianist than a studio musician. Martin tried, but ultimately conceded that it was beyond him. For the producer, who had once been their guiding force, this was a humbling moment. McCartney, frustrated but determined, brought in a session pianist to record the part. The decision might seem small, but it reflected a larger truth about the Beatles in 1968. Their music had outgrown even the man who helped shape them. The band was chasing perfection, and not even George Martin could always keep up. This incident also sheds light on McCartney's personality during this era. He was uncompromising, even relentless when it came to his music. If someone couldn't meet his standards, he would find someone who could. This caused friction inside the band. John Lennon often bristled at Paul's dominance in the studio, and George Harrison felt sidelined when Paul would dictate arrangements without leaving room for collaboration. Ringo Starr, famously, even walked out during the White Album sessions because of the overwhelming tension. For George Martin, Martha, My Dear was his own version of that struggle. He wasn't being sidelined emotionally, but technically. He simply couldn't give Paul what he wanted.
It's telling that the song wasn't even a band performance. McCartney recorded it almost entirely by himself, using other musicians only when absolutely necessary. That approach highlighted how fractured the group dynamic had become. The White Album is filled with tracks where each Beatle worked independently, and Martha, My Dear is one of the clearest examples. It wasn't the Beatles as a collective, it was Paul's project, with others filling in the gaps. George Martin's inability to play the piano part symbolized something larger. It marked the point where the band's ambitions had pushed beyond what even their most trusted collaborator could comfortably deliver. For Martin, it must have been bittersweet. He had watched these four young men evolve into cultural icons, but now their music was becoming so advanced, so demanding, that he could no longer be the steady hand behind everything.
Looking back, Martin himself admitted his limitations without shame. He recognized that the piano part was better left to a professional session player. But that didn't erase the sting. For someone who had been integral to the Beatles' rise, to have to step aside on a track because it was too intricate must have felt like watching the band move on without him. And yet, Martha, My Dear remains a testament to McCartney's ambition and Martin's humility. The song wouldn't be what it is without Martin's production, but the fact that he couldn't play the piano part shows just how far the music had pushed beyond conventional boundaries. It was no longer about what was easy or comfortable. It was about creating something new, no matter the cost. The irony is that most listeners wouldn't recognize the difficulty of the part when they hear the song. It flows so smoothly that it sounds effortless, but that illusion of effortlessness is what made the Beatles so powerful. They hid the struggle, the arguments, the technical failures behind music that sounded inevitable. In reality, every song was a battle, and sometimes even their producer lost. George Martin's admission about Martha, My Dear also highlights a deeper truth about the Beatles' story. Their journey wasn't just about talent, it was about constantly exceeding expectations, even at the risk of fracturing relationships. Paul McCartney didn't care if the piano part was too hard. He wanted it done right. And in that pursuit, he was willing to push past the limits of everyone around him, including George Martin. By the end of the 1960s, this dynamic defined the band. John, Paul, George, and Ringo were no longer looking to Martin for guidance. They were chasing their own visions, sometimes at the expense of each other. Martin remained essential, but he was no longer untouchable. The fact that Martha, My Dear required outside help is proof of that shift. In the grand story of the Beatles, this moment might seem like a footnote, but it represents something crucial. Even the man who helped them reach the top had moments where he couldn't keep up. That reality is what made the Beatles both brilliant and destructive. They demanded more than anyone could reasonably give, and sometimes even their closest ally had to step aside.